My brother and I have always been intrigued by the unexplainable. Like many, we're fascinated with stories of the supernatural, fringe science, and modern-day mysteries.
Though we've seen no first-hand proof of its existence, our minds remain open to the possibility.
Unsatisfied with the so-called evidence on television and the internet, we are choosing to take matters into our own hands and conduct our own interviews and research.
Now we're on a quest to speak with as many people as we can and hear the stories of these events from those who have lived them.
No Hollywood effects or exaggerations, and no hidden agenda. We invite you to listen and decide what and who you believe.
We are the Brothers Mysterium.
Hello and welcome to the Brothers Mysterium. My name is Tommy. My brother's name is Eric. But he is not here today. He's on a brief hiatus, filling in, though, another member of the Mysterium family. Father Mysterium, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom. Nice to be here.
Thanks for filling in. You're the first ever person to co-host the show. Quite the honor. We're excited to have you. And if you like the Brothers Mysterium and you're excited to listen to us, please give us a like, a rate, and a review on whatever podcast provider you use. And now I'm going to read a few of our latest reviews, just so you know what other people are saying. LB22 said, "I'm mystified. Extremely clever and engaging podcast that delves into unique topics, such as mirror touch synesthesia, ghost trains, and spontaneous human combustion, to name a few. I appreciate the measured, analytical approach. Definitely gives you something to think about and keep thinking about. Would highly recommend it. It is a quality production." Person rating a zombie game said, "Great topics with awesome hosts." And Demps NY City said, "Well-researched and reported, with an appropriate amount of skepticism considering the subject matter. A really even-handed look at the unexplained." So we want to thank everybody who's already taken the time to rate and review us. And if you haven't yet, we ask you do that, as well as go to facebook.com/thebrothersmysterium and give us a like. And today's show is going to be kind of medical mysteries. And it's a topic that I've always been fascinated with, simply because it's a little more based in science. It's science meeting the supernatural, the mystical and mysterious meeting the medical world, as opposed to the more folklore tales of down the street. They say in the 1800s that a woman was a witch and killed her family, and there's kind of a disconnect. But I find that these kind of fringe science stories are a little more intriguing, and I wonder if part of that is my own bias in that members of the medical community are usually very well-educated intellectuals. They like reasoning, logical people, very analytical. So I find that when they have these stories, it sort of sucks me in a bit more. What are your thoughts on such things?
Well, as I was thinking about it, on my way up here, knowing we were going to sit down and talk, it struck me that there are times when there's a balance between between the scientific and probably just our own instincts. And I also think that there are times when we can almost become so smart that we're stupid, that we learn things, we want to be analytical, we want to be medicated through situations. And sometimes I think we forget that for years people understood what herbs and diet and chemistry and caring for ourselves, exercise, and all these things, that they benefit us physically and also help us mentally. Just a simple thing of like being dehydrated and you suddenly find yourself not thinking clearly, that it relates to that whole chemical balance in your body. So that I think if we get over-medicated, sometimes we're taking too many things that are in conflict, or we're not really feeling our own body, understanding our own body and what it's trying to tell us.
Great points. Another thing that I thought of when thinking about this topic is in episode 1, Eric and I talked about how hospitals should sort of be a hotspot for ghosts. You have a high concentration of death all in one building, as well as life. It's kind of the circle of life. Babies are born, people are passing away. There's a lot of emotional energy. As people pass away, realize they're going to die, loved ones get bad news, people get diagnosed with terminal conditions. So you would think, and doctors just dealing with life and death situations might have more likelihood of coming across a paranormal or supernatural event, perhaps. But one reason I am glad you are here, and I don't mean to throw a curveball at you, is when it comes to non-medical people I know, you seem to have a lot of stories of you being the last one to speak with someone before they passed, possibly minutes, if not shortly thereafter. Would you maybe share one of two of those stories that stick out in your mind? You can be as generic on the details as you want, but could you just tell us one of those incidents, perhaps?
Well, yeah, as you said, there are several, and it's always been an intriguing thing to me. One of them, I visited someone I had worked with for many years who was in the hospital, and I left and I got down to my car, and I was one of the first people to have a car phone. I had a built-in car phone in the car, and it was just because I had to be in touch with a lot of people all the time, but I was also on the road. The phone rings, and somebody from my office is saying, have you visited so-and-so? Have you visited him today? And I said, I actually just left, and they said, well, that's weird because we just got a call that he passed away. And so literally, I had walked out of the hospital while this person passed away, and they called the office to notify us that he was gone, and just struck me as such an eerie experience. Had it also happened where I went down to visit a friend who lived in the Baltimore area, who I'd worked with for years and really had gotten very friendly with, and knew he was failing, but had supper with him, left and was on the way home and got a phone call like that he had passed away right after supper. And even I think of it in our own lives when we went and visited my mom, and we were there for a week and spent time visiting every day at the nursing home where she was, and got home, and like the day later, my sister called early in the morning and said, Mom died last night. And it was as if she was waiting like to say goodbye, or just waiting one more time to see you. Just very, very, again, mysterious, part of that Mysterium world that we live in.
Absolutely. And especially with the occasions where you're kind of on your way out. You literally were just with this person, you get in the car, you find out they passed away. Obviously there are the usual feelings of sadness and reflecting on all your memories with that individual. Was there a tinge of anything paranormal, otherworldly? Could you sense, did you know this person's going to go any minute possibly? Anything on a different kind of vibration that stuck with you besides just the eeriness of, walking out the door and then finding out that they had passed?
Not really. I did not have a sense that it was going to happen. But I did feel when I reflected back on it that they all seemed to be at peace. They seemed to be very, relaxed and calm. They were not in any distress. And the other thing that people have asked me is, like, after that happened to you, were you spooked? Did you feel like something was wrong, or that something evil had happened, or that something, was just not right? And I said, no, I did not. It was almost as if I was prepared also for their passing on, which, again, in a strange way, just seems to be part of the cycle of life.
That's true. And you said something that reminded me of a Buddhist philosophy, which is a lot of the training of the tranquility of the mind and meditation is solely almost, not only does it give you a more peaceful life, but it's so at the moment when you die, they believe that you have to be very calm and in a good place mentally in order to have a smooth transition to what lay beyond, as opposed to screaming and, I don't want to go, and kicking. They're kind of afraid that if you pass like that, it's going to throw off this transition to the next world. And it always reminds me also of hunting. Not that I'm a hunter, and this might not even be true, but I once heard that the reason you have to sneak up before you shoot a deer and you want to do it in one shot is because if you wound it and it's running where you scare it, it'll tense up, and then the meat doesn't taste as good because it's whatever, the adrenaline's been released and all the muscles are tense and squeezed, and it's harder as opposed to soft.
Oh, interesting.
And again, I'm not a hunter, so
No.
if you are a hunter listening and that's just like a wives' tale, let me know. But interesting that you mentioned the calmness in the room as I said, in just kind of studying Buddhism. I know that that's a big thing. They always say, when it comes to the end of your life, you need to accept it and kind of calmly allow what's going to happen, as opposed to trying to fight it, or I don't want to go, I've got all this stuff left to do, And when it came time to put together this episode, I did reach out to any medical people I knew, first responders, police, firemen, EMTs, paramedics, any ER people, nurses, doctors, dentists, school nurses, anybody, and I couldn't get anything. They all said, no, nothing weird. I've seen people die, but nothing paranormal. So I was a little upset because I wanted to do a medical episode, but then maybe like a year and a half later, actually, my friend Jamie reached out to me about an interesting experience that she had.
The Brothers Mysterium.
My name is Jamie. I'm a registered nurse at a level 1 trauma center, and I work in the surgical ICU. Our patients are commonly admitted to the hospital after falls, car accidents, motorcycle accidents, fires, things like that.
And Jamie was aware of this podcast and my interest in the supernatural and paranormal. So after she had experienced something weird one night at work, she called me a few days later to discuss it. I then told her about this particular episode and asked if she would be down to record and share what had happened to her. This is what she experienced.
A few months back, we admitted a patient who was in a car accident with her entire family. Her husband and her husband's parents died at the scene, but the patient somehow managed to rescue her 11-month-old child and got him out of the car before the car burst into flames. She was actually still inside of it. When she got to the hospital, she was 30% burns. She had a bunch of broken bones. She had bleeds in her head. She was really a mess, but within a few months, we had stabilized her enough to send her to another floor. She was doing really well on the other floor. She was starting to walk again and talk again and get back to her normal self. While she was on one of the other floors, she actually had a stroke, which resulted in a continuous seizure, so she was readmitted to our floor. When she came up, they hooked her up to an EEG machine, which is an electroencephalogram. And that basically measures electrical activity, what's going on in your brain. It's helpful in diagnosing seizures, and we usually keep people on the machine for 24 or 48 hours just to measure the activity in their brain. So this woman was put onto the machine, and when the technician comes up, they actually set up a small, it's almost like a laptop screen, and it has a camera attached to it, which is looking at the patient. So on the screen, you see the live feed of the brain activity of the EEG, but you also see an image of the patient in front of you. They do this so that they can look back and see, if the brain activity was showing a seizure, how is the patient presenting? But I was taking care of this patient one night, and when I looked in the room, I saw something on the screen. So I walked in, and the screen had shown above her head, like in the air above her, almost a halo. It was like a bright light. It almost looked like a reflection of something. So when I looked off of the screen at the actual patient, I didn't see anything. I thought that was kind of strange. So I started playing around with some of the lights, with the curtains. It was about 2 a.m. at this time, so I knew it wasn't the sun shining in or anything like that. But I moved, the curtains on the windows. I moved the door. I shut it. I was trying to figure out what was making this halo, and, it just seemed odd to me. I didn't feel threatened in any way. I wasn't concerned about any sort of paranormal activity, but it did kind of make sense, knowing, where this woman came from, that people had passed away in the accident that she was in, and also just she was in such a compromised state. We didn't know whether she was going to live or die. We didn't know whether she was inside her head. We weren't sure exactly what was going on. So I noticed above the bed we have a track, and it keeps IV poles. So it's just like a big metal pole that kind of hangs down, and it's pretty high up. I couldn't reach it from where I was standing, and I noticed that it was swinging above her. So I pulled over a chair, and I stood up on the chair, and I tried to hold it still. And when I held it still, it stopped. And the second I let go, it began swinging again, almost like a pendulum, right above her head. So again, I found this strange, but didn't think too much into it. I went into one of the other rooms, just, investigating. And I stood on one of the chairs, and I was touching the IV pole. And this one didn't swing at all. So I went back into her room, and the halo remained there, and the pole continued to swing above her head. I did feel almost a sense of sorrow in the room. I mean, it's a tragic story. It was a horrible case to take care of, and meeting some of her other family members, you felt for them. She is young, she's 32 years old, she saved the life of her child, lost her husband, lost her in-laws, but she, performed a miracle in my eyes. And then the fact that after the accident she was doing so well, I just felt like maybe this was her representation of herself, or maybe her husband looking down at her. I couldn't exactly figure out what I thought about this beam of light, but I kind of left it alone and I walked out of the room, and I felt sad. I really did. I felt sad for this woman. I felt sad for the family that did live on for her. And I knew that coming up, the doctors were looking to talk to her family about what kind of quality of life she would have if they remained her on life support, and if she stayed in this kind of state with the seizures and with the stroke, she really didn't have much quality of life. So they wanted to have a family meeting the next day. And again, my shift ended. I went home. I didn't think anything of this. And then when I came back the next night, the halo was gone. And she seemed even more lethargic than usual. Like, she already was unresponsive, but now it was really just a soulless body lying in the bed. And it turned out that the family had decided to pull the plug and to put her on what we call comfort care, which is basically we do everything we can to make sure the patient's comfortable in their last few hours of life. She was completely dependent on the ventilator, so we knew that once we extubated her and took her off of the ventilation that she would probably pass away fairly quickly. Which is what happened, and it was hard for all of us. She had come such a long way, and we knew her story, and you felt like you knew her. But I like to think that maybe the halo above was her soul leaving her body. Maybe that was her looking back and saying, you know what, I'm ready to go. I'm going to be with my husband. Maybe it was the husband looking down on her. I'm not 100%, but it was definitely unexplainable.
So that was Jamie's story. I want to thank her for sharing it with us. Very interesting. She kind of saw the halo, is where it starts after tragic events with the car accident. Sees the halo in the monitor, not physically above the woman. And one thing that I loved about this is Jamie used healthy skepticism. She saw this halo and she said, let me play with the lights. Let me check the window, check the blinds. Same thing when she saw that there was sort of the movement above her head, the woman's head, on the IV pole. She went in the room next door and tried to recreate it. And I love when people have the initiative to right then and there look into it, just do some, little bit of testing, because now, looking back on it, we can't just say to her, it was probably just the sunlight. So I want to give her props for taking the initiative to look into it right then and there, because when you do that, it kind of eliminates possibilities for what it could be, which opens the door to what it might be. Would you like to share your reflections on Jamie's story?
Sure. Again, you're right. I think the thing that I liked was that she sort of described it in clinical and analytical terms. Fascinating that she was able to rescue her child unharmed, and yet she was in the car when it burst into flames, and then is the one who suffered more than even the people who were killed instantly. And then how she then had a stroke. It seemed like she was recovering. Her bones were setting and her skin was healing, but then she had a stroke. And when they started doing these EEGs, these electroencephalograms, they is when they noticed on that split screen that there was some other aura there. And I very much liked that she did go and try to check other rooms, see if there was different lighting. And I found it fascinating the way she described that the pole above the patient was swinging like a pendulum. It almost had a rhythm to it. And I could picture that as soon as she said it. I said, wow, there's a sense there of almost like the pendulum on a clock, like time passing. And but she also said that there was a sense of sorrow in the room. And it seems, again, that time passing sensation, that this is moving and yet something's moving on from here. So I did like very much the way she described this story and told the story. Not that it was as if it was pre-rehearsed, but more that she had really experienced it and had been reflecting on it in her own life. So, and I think that's something that's true of people who are in she was a surgical nurse in this trauma unit. She's probably seen an awful lot of this, so she's not shocked by it. But still, after a while, I'm sure you get that sensation, here it's happening again. The patient has begun a decline, or here's something, this sensation is starting again. They can see things in people's faces, in their breathing pattern, and in the way they move. So
yeah. And interesting, as you said, she has probably been through it before, so the fact that there was something different this time, that she said, this is unique, this is not just, this patient's slipping away, we lost this patient. As you said, I noticed that she said there was sort of a sense of sorrow, and shortly thereafter, the halo was gone the next day, the next night, and she said the patient was just sort of a soulless body at that point. It was almost as if she had left, to which Jamie kind of theorized, was that the woman's spirit leaving? Was that what that halo aura was? And maybe that was some sort of energy or magnetic force or something which was causing the pendulum swing? Or if not the woman's soul leaving, was it her husband hovering above her, maybe coming to claim her soul? We'll never know, but to think of it that way is sort of a beautiful ending to a tragic tale, which I can appreciate. But it's definitely a head scratcher. It's one of those things where it seems kind of like it's just a simple thing at first. A weird little shine on a monitor above her head, but then that can't be solved with the lighting and the window, and then the pole above her starts swinging, and then it all stops, and suddenly she seems more lifeless, more soulless than before, and then passed away once they kind of turned off the machines, the ventilator. It makes you wonder about, was that indeed her soul, her energy, whatever you want to call it, her spirit, her aura, passing on?
Clearly unexplainable, but something that triggered a curiosity in my mind, and something that I've seen you see in a movie or in a TV show, is this awareness of someone in a deep coma or possibly near death, where they can listen, but they're not able to communicate in any way. You'll see it sometimes in a show where somebody sits and is just reading to a person who's comatose, or playing music, or humming, or just talking and relating stories. And it also made me think in another sense, because Jamie said that after the family meeting, it seemed like the halo was gone, and that during that meeting, the family had decided on comfort care for their mom or their sister. And so that was a way, in the last hours of her life, all of the mechanical support was being slowly weaned off. It was being turned down, and she was on her own. And you wonder, almost like the sense of being the soul or the spirit leaving, was it sort of a loss of hope that she now had heard her family have this meeting and say, well, let's just put her on comfort care and let her die peacefully. And with that loss of hope, it's as if the pendulum swings to the other side, and the patient says, well, if my husband is calling, maybe I should join him. Maybe it's time to give up this fight. Just, again, unexplainable, we'll never know. But when you think of those possibilities and the way the ebb and flow of life is, it is something to really consider.
Absolutely. Great analogy with the pendulum. And you just made me also think of a lot of times with near-death experiences, there are out-of-body experiences where somebody's on the operating table, but they say that, they could see themselves being operated on. They can kind of fly around the hospital, and they'll hear conversations that their loved ones had in the waiting room. And then when they survive, they'll wake up and say, hey, doc, why were you doing that? And the doctor would say, how would you know that's the way we were treating this? Or, hey, mom, thanks for telling them I'd be okay. And the mom would say, we were in the parking lot. How could you know? So to your point, maybe her spirit, soul, whatever you want to call it, did have that, her consciousness was able to be present for that meeting and did hear them say, we love her too much to keep her on these machines. We should just let her pass peacefully. And then maybe that was the closure she needed to say, okay, it's not worth fighting for anymore. I will go return to my husband and move along. So I want to thank Jamie for sharing that story, a very moving story experience. And we also have another experience then from a woman I found online named Dina.
Hi, my first name is Dina, and I live in Central Florida. I am 35 years old now, and I was 34 at the time my story takes place.
And Dina's experience involves a hospice nurse and her mother.
My mom was in a hospice, and she was dying, and of course, that's a difficult time in anybody's life when it's the time that one of their parents is passing away. She'd been there for about a week and a half, and my brother had decided to drive down because the doctors had just told us that they had seen some signs that indicated that she would be probably going within the next couple of days. So, if not sooner. So my brother wanted to get down as quickly as possible, understandably, so he drove overnight several states to come down and be with her. And one day, well, thankfully he did make it in time, and one day he and I were the only ones in her room with her, and she was still very conscious and lucid at that point, and we were both sitting on either side of her bed and just having a normal conversation with her. I think we were talking about some new clothes that I had bought one of my daughters, and she was even able to give her opinion on some of them, if that gives you an idea that she was pretty much with it.
That looks good. Oh, that's a nice outfit.
So she seemed to know what was going on, but she was not upset. She was pretty much accepting, and it was a relatively pleasant conversation.
I like that one a lot.
And she seemed very lucid at the time.
That will look very cute on her.
And then all of a sudden, my mom started counting. And as she counted, 1, 2, 3, 4, as she got to each new number, she would point her finger at a different spot of the room.
5, 6, 7, 8.
And of course, there was nothing in the conversation to warrant this, so my brother and I both asked her, what are you doing, Mom? And she said,
I'm just counting everyone in this room. I'm just counting all these people. How did you guys get so many people to come and see me?
And we just kind of looked at each other like, what are you talking about? And a nurse had entered the room at that time, and she was, doing her different duties that she performed. She was making adjustments and checking medications and things like that. She didn't say anything at the time. And my mom had continued counting, and she got up to 12.
9, 10, 11, 12.
And I remember she just got a really pleased look on her face, and she said, I don't know how you guys got so many people to come here to see me, and I know them all.
I know them all.
And she just looked really happy. And we sort of, at the time we thought it was weird, but we sort of blew it off, like we didn't want to do anything to upset her. So we just finished out our visit, and then, at one point we went out to get dinner, I think. And the same nurse who had been in earlier pulled us aside in the hall and said, you know what your mom was doing in there? And we said, you mean the counting? And she said, yes. And she said she was talking about a lot of people being in the room with her, a large number of people, even though it was actually only the three of us. She said that's something that happens with a lot of patients. And she said that she was probably seeing people who had gone before her, and that's a very common experience to have. They see that a lot at the hospice house. And then she said something I'll never forget, that sometimes the staff and the family members see those people too, which my brother and I didn't. We didn't see anyone or anything except the three people that were in the room, but the nurse told us that sometimes that's something that happens.
As a follow-up, and just out of curiosity, I did ask Dina if her mother was either A, into the paranormal at all, or B, religious in any way, wondering if those tendencies might have impacted what she was seeing.
For the first, no, she wasn't really into the paranormal at all, and she had never been religious for most of her life. The last 2 years of her life, once she got diagnosed with cancer, and her husband had passed away 2 years before, she did start attending a church. And personally, I feel it was more for the community and the companionship that it was providing to her, but she had never been extremely religious before that. I wouldn't classify her that way.
So that was Dina's story. We want to thank her for sharing that. Obviously, never easy to lose a loved one, a parent. In this case, it was her mother. And a very interesting, simple, but really interesting story of her and her brother are just with her mother, their mother, as she's passing. And she suddenly starts counting. They don't really know what she's counting. Then she says, I'm counting people. All these people came to see me. She's very pleased. The mother was happy. Can't believe you got so many people. I know them all. It's very weird, hard to explain, and especially because they said that they were having conversations with her. Dina said she was commenting on photos. She was very lucid. I actually also, as a follow-up, before we dig into this, I did ask Dina if her mother was on any medication that might cause hallucinations or anything like that, or if she was having any signs of dementia or confusion, to which Dina said no, none of that. She was not on anything that they were told would lead to her seeing things.
Was she on medication or suffering from dementia or anything that might have caused hallucination? No, she was not suffering from dementia. And she died of colon cancer, and, that really doesn't generally present as having any dementia-related symptoms. Was she on any medication? Yes. She was on some painkillers at the time. She was on a morphine derivative, and she was on, I believe, methadone at the time. I'm not sure if those cause hallucinations or not. The doctors did tell us about some of the side effects, and hallucinations weren't one of them. They weren't something that was listed, so we assumed not, but, she was on medication at the time.
Now, there have been reports that a morphine drip can cause hallucinations, so it is very possible that that is the explanation for what Dina's mother was seeing, simply a side effect of the morphine. However, for the purpose of our discussion here, we will assume that it was not a side effect of the drug, and explore the possibility that this was indeed a supernatural occurrence. What made it even more baffling is when the nurse, who had came into the room at this point, pulls them aside in the hallway and says, what your mother was doing, happens a lot. A lot of patients see people that they know, see loved ones who had passed before them. And she even goes as far as to say sometimes staff members or family members will also see people in the room. She didn't go into too much detail, but I have heard other stories like that where, a nurse will see somebody come in, the woman will say, oh, that's my husband. And when she turns around to say, oh, hello, the person's gone. And later, a daughter will come in and she'll say, oh, your father was here. And then the daughter obviously says the father passed away 5 years ago. So quick glances here and there, quick appearances, corner of the eye type appearances from people. But it's very interesting that the nurse at the hospice seemed to think this was a pretty common occurrence. What was your take on Dina's experience?
I thought it was great the way she described her mother's condition, that she was lucid and with it, that she was dying of cancer, so she was on some medications, but nothing that seemed like it would be hallucinogenic, just some basic painkillers. And I also thought that she sort of set the stage, set the stage for where her mom was in her life. That only recently had she seemed to have rediscovered some faith after her cancer diagnosis and after her husband's death. But it wasn't that she was someone who was praying constantly or in any kind of a depressed state or an overly zealous state, that she was not really a believer in the paranormal, and that she had not had any recent change in some of her beliefs, that she seemed to be consistently, still her mom. Because I think you get this point where there's this clash between your mental and your physical state. If your physical state is causing you a lot of suffering, pain can do strange things to the mind. Obviously, the medications can. And just maybe feeling that something is wrong within your body, but not really able to sense what it is, can just change your perspective on things. So I thought it really set the stage for her mom being in a very positive and functioning state. And yet, this point of saying, she suddenly counted, and it seemed like I think she said, Dina said that she counted 12 people or something.
Right.
And again, that's one of those numbers sometimes that you look at and say, interesting, like there's the 12 apostles, and there's different other things that numbers sort of have a commonality to them. But you almost wonder that as maybe the pain subsides, or you begin to sort of leave your physical stress and strain behind and become like just a sort of a mental being, that you are more at peace and happier, and you're meeting the people who you've liked throughout your life. You're recalling them, and you can envision them, and so it's almost like you're in a dreamlike state. And I even thought of the line about from Field of Dreams, "Is this heaven?" And he said, "No, it's Iowa." But, it was that whole state of envisioning people walking out of the cornfield and people that they had played against in baseball, and then a healing process between father and son, and sort of that reconciliation at the end of your life where you look and say, everything's going to be okay, it's all going to work out, But I thought a really very loving story of their mom, not bitter, not saying, oh, she died, she had cancer, it was horrible, but sort of being, and to be able to be there at a moment like that, where you see your mom at such peace, and really probably in her face just showing the joy at recalling all these happy memories, or at the prospect of maybe getting to see these people again. So really a very, very interesting combination.
Absolutely. And one thing that she pointed out that you referenced as where you said it was maybe more of a dream state, as you're recalling people, you can almost envision them. It brings to mind the frequency, as the nurse had stated, many patients see it, but just commonalities of all different people. Some of the major things people say is, I saw a bright light, I started seeing loved ones, they were meeting me, they were calling to me. I felt at peace, I felt I was in this glow. All of these different traits that no matter what religion you're in, no matter what sex, age you are, what language you speak, a lot of commonalities come along with death or near-death experiences, people who are able to report back, at least. But it's interesting that sometimes there's a life review where you start seeing different events from your life. It flashes before your eyes. But it's interesting that a lot of times people who have also passed away will just return to you. So it makes you wonder are those people really returning to kind of welcome you, and they're the welcoming committee to bring you to whatever lies beyond? Or is it maybe more, as you were saying, where more of that person's own memory as they leave their body, leave the physical plane, are their memories kind of appearing to them? There's kind of a blurred line there as they're transitioning from life into death. Makes one wonder.
Absolutely.
So I want to thank Dina again for sharing her story. And then I was, as I said, waiting a long time to put together this episode when I was put in touch with a doctor who himself wrote a fantastic book.
My name is Scott Kolbaba. I'm a physician in Wheaton, Illinois, and I've written a book called Physicians' Untold Stories. I practice medicine, internal medicine, and I've done that for about 35 years now.
And I actually was able to speak with him about not only his own experiences, but experiences from fellow physicians he was able to gather that delve into the mysterious, the miraculous, the paranormal. And here is that conversation.
Hello.
Hey, Scott, this is Tommy from the Brothers Mysterium. How are you?
Good, Tommy.
And I was given a copy of Physicians' Untold Stories, which I was able to read before our chat. Well, thank you for making the time, first and foremost.
Thank you. This should be fun.
And this book was definitely everything I was looking for when the concept for this episode first came to me. I was very excited to be able to discuss it all in further detail with the author himself. I'll start off right off the bat with the question of, why write this book?
That's a good question. Well, I'm a busy doc. I've got 7 kids. I've got a busy practice, and my leisure time is somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. So the question of why I wrote this book is a good one. My wife thinks it was a temporary insanity, but I had a few unusual experiences myself that I just couldn't quite explain. And then a couple docs started coming to me with unusual stories too, and these are ordinary docs that don't have any reason to tell me these really unusual occurrences. And so I started thinking about whether or not these would be helpful to put on paper, and if anyone would be interested in reading them, and if they would give other people hope and peace and help in this crazy world. So I as a doc, you have lots of different patients in various professions, and I have a patient that was a publisher, head of a publishing company. So I called him up and I said, I've got some stories. I'd like to sit down with you, if you don't mind, for lunch and listen to some of these stories and tell me if you think they're of any worth, if I should think about writing them down and publishing them, because I'm not a writer. I'm a doc, and I've never written anything before. He said, sure. So we sat down at a lunch, and I started telling him stories, and we were both really hungry, so we were chowing down, and I wasn't paying much attention to what he was doing. I was eating and telling stories. And all of a sudden, he stopped eating. And I looked up, and he had tears in his eyes. And he said, you have to write these stories down. These are moving stories. And I was a little surprised. I was really moved myself when I saw this head of a publishing house that was so moved by the stories that I was telling that it brought him to tears, not from sadness, but just from emotion. And he said, you have to write these down. You have to write a book. And that's pretty much what got me motivated and got me started. And then I started to hang out in the doctor's lounge and talk with docs, and I'd ask them if they had any stories, because doctors don't talk about these things. Doctors talk about routine things of life, like their golf game or the next potassium level that somebody had, or gallbladder surgery that somebody else is going to be going for it, but not these stories. And so I collected a number of stories, and then one thing led to another, and I ultimately wrote the book, which was a real hassle, to be honest with you. It took about 4 years, a couple lawyers, a couple editors, a lot of money, but I finally made it come to pass.
Very cool. And you kind of touched on this. This was one of my questions for you. So is it not common for doctors, people in the medical community, your colleagues, to have these types of stories, or to at least share them with one another? I can see not telling patients, but it's not like, like you said, you're not in the lunchroom trading paranormal encounters or anything usually.
I don't think in the years, I've practiced about 35 years, as I mentioned to you, and I don't think in those years, up until the last about 5 years, I've never heard any story like this, ever. Doctors don't talk about these things, and doctors generally don't talk about deep spiritual feelings either. They tend to be pretty superficial with one another. Even the docs that I know really well. I was just shocked at some of the stuff that I heard, and very pleasantly surprised. And the number of doctors that had stories, and the ones that I put in the book were the ones that were really spectacular stories. I heard lots of stories that didn't make it into the book that were really pretty awesome stories that I've never heard before. But the ones that I included were the ones that really touched me. They had to make me cry from emotion or give me goosebumps before I put them in the book. But no, doctors don't talk about this stuff. I was really surprised. And I was also surprised they let me put their names down and publish them in a book like this, because the doctors I talk with are very successful doctors. They have great practices. They're doing very well. And they really took a risk to tell me these stories and to let me publish them with their names on them. And that was every doctor but one allowed me to put their name on the story. And the one doctor that didn't was a doctor that the story was really about him and a stroke that he had. He didn't want people to know that he had a stroke.
Right. So with that said, were you yourself, because it's you and 26 other physician stories, but you're kind of the flagship guy, were you worried about putting your own career, reputation, credibility on the line by asking other doctors for these stories and then going so far as to publish it in a book?
Well, absolutely. I was worried about what patients would say about me. If you have a reputation for being a relatively conservative doc and you don't believe in things that you generally talk about things that are spiritual with patients, I was concerned that patients would think of me as being a little bit different, and not use me as their doctor. But as the whole process evolved, and this is like a 4-year process, what I found was that when I was telling stories, I would tell patients. I love to talk to patients, and that's probably why I like to be a doctor like I am. I love to talk with patients, and I would tell them some of these stories, and the responses that I got were spectacular, were amazing. And what I found was that most people, or most families at least, and almost everyone has had a story, something like this. There's some kind of a story where they were touched by an unseen hand, or where they had an unusual coincidence that they really couldn't explain. And when I told them these stories, the response that I got was very commonly, "Oh, I've got a story like that too," and they would tell me their story. And I heard some wonderful patient stories. I didn't put them in the book. The only stories I put in the book were the doctor stories. But I think hearing these stories gave patients and everyone permission to talk about these stories, because many people don't talk about the stories either, just like the doctors don't.
Right.
And so it was interesting to see what transpired. And when we had our launch, a lot of the doctors came, and they were incredibly surprised and pleasantly surprised that they were treated like heroes. Thank you for bringing these stories out to the public, because we have experienced these stories too, or like this, and so it was really an amazing event, and that's been the case ever since. The doctors are revered as being courageous.
And do you think that maybe signals like a cultural shift? Is it maybe you came along at the right place, right time, where is the medical community, if not people in general, the public, kind of more open, more willing to receive this type of story without being a skeptic right away?
I think so. I mean, it's not. I'm not the leader of the pack here, and it's not because of my book necessarily, but I think what I'm seeing in television and in movies and in other books is that there are more and more people coming out with stories like this, and I think it's becoming more common, and I think people are feeling a little bit easier about telling these stories to others and revealing their stories and their family stories, for example.
Right. And you had some really interesting stories of your own that are included in the book. One that I was hoping you would share with the listeners is about the lung scan. Can you talk about that story?
Sure. This is one of the stories that first got me going and made me realize that maybe there was something that I needed to write down. And I had a patient that went to a business trip to, I think, Arkansas, and he called me up on the trip, and he said, "I've got this pain I got after eating. It's right upper abdomen. I'm a little nauseated. It hurts quite a bit. And what should I do?" And I said, "Well, go to the emergency room and check it out. Sounds like your gallbladder." So he did, and they called me from the emergency room a couple hours later and said, "We've done all the tests. We've done an ultrasound and blood tests and everything. We gave him some narcotic medication to calm the pain down, and he's feeling a lot better now." The studies were all normal, the blood tests and the ultrasounds, and I'm thinking to myself, "Oh, they're missing something here." But I didn't say anything, and so I talked with my patient. I said, "When you come home, if you're still having the problem, visit me, and we'll take a look at you, and we'll do some additional testing and bring your records." So he did, and he came back, and he was still having the problem, right upper abdominal pain, and that's where the gallbladder is. And so I thought, well, we didn't do the right test. Maybe we'll do some more sophisticated gallbladder tests. So we did. We did some additional blood tests, and they were all normal. And it was very frustrating because as a doc, you like to make the diagnosis, especially when the person's hurting like this. And so we did a few additional tests, and everything came back okay. And I was very troubled by that. And a couple of days later, I woke up in the morning, first thing, and I just had this really strong feeling that he needed to have a lung scan. Now, that really didn't make a lot of sense because his pain was his abdomen, and he had all the tests of the abdominal that would scan his abdomen and so forth, but nothing of his lung. And he wasn't having lung symptoms. He wasn't having a cough or shortness of breath or anything else. But I just had that incredibly strong feeling, so I called him up, which is really unusual in the morning to call up a patient and say, I'd like to schedule you for a test, because usually my nurse schedules tests. And so he said, I'm sorry, I can't do it today because I'm flying out to Denver, and I can't have the test today. And I said, I really got that sick feeling inside. You know how you feel like you've got to do something and you're being frustrated. And so I said, what time's your flight? And he said, I think it was like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so I said, if I can get it in before noon, would you go along with it? And there was a long silence at the end of the phone. And finally he said, okay, I'll humor you. So I called up the hospital and I ordered the test, and the next available test was like 2 days from then, but I also was on the silent side. And they finally caved in and said, okay, send him right over. So about an hour later, or hour and a half or so, I got a call from the radiologist, and he said, nice call, Scott. And I said, what do you mean? He said, the lung scan showed a massive pulmonary embolus, a blood clot in his lung right over his diaphragm. That's why he was having abdominal pain and not chest pain. Had he flown out today like he was planning, he likely died from another pulmonary embolus. And that gave me goosebumps and kind of weak knees, and we immediately put him in the hospital, discovered that he had a hereditary clotting disorder for which he's now on blood thinners forever. But that lung scan literally saved his life. And I couldn't explain that. I couldn't explain the feeling that I had that was just, it was a feeling that I just simply couldn't ignore. Now, I suppose it's, some people could say it's a coincidence, or, you're a good doctor, so you knew what to do, but it was just something that I woke up with and just had to do, which is very strange for me. And thank goodness I did, and it literally saved his life. I saw him for a physical a couple of weeks ago. He's doing fine. His wife's fine. They've got a daughter that's going to college, but that was one of the first things that got me really interested in if other doctors had some of these experiences too.
Yeah, and that's definitely a wild story with, luckily, a happy ending. And you broke your book up into 4 parts. We'll kind of go through each part. That story you just told is from the first part, divine intervention. Can you kind of talk about, I guess we'll go through each part and then kind of decide how you chose to break it up in that way. But let's start with divine intervention. What made you kind of choose that as one of the 4 major topics of the book?
The editor frequently helps you divide things up. I just took the stories down and wrote the stories. And you have a couple of editors. My first editor actually was my wife, who did a great job. And then you have a couple other editors that do spelling and all these kinds of things. And my editor suggested I divide it up like this, and made some suggestions. And that's why we put it. There's divine intervention, death in the afterlife, healing, and the 4th one is prayer. So it just seemed to be able, we were able to kind of group the stories together in similar categories, and that's why we did it.
Very cool. And so with your story you just told us, when you woke up and just had that urge, something's in the lung, even though it went against, everything you had already thought and looked at, would you say that is some sort of divine intervention? And if so, do you think that's God? Do you, how would you sort of explain where that came from?
Every doc in the story, in the book, had different ideas about what prompted their miracle or whatever it was. But I think what happened there was, I think it was divine intervention from God. I believe there is a God. I believe there's something higher than us, and I believe that what happened there was something that I just couldn't explain, and I think it was God's hand that intervened and saved the life of one of my patients.
Right. Another very cool story that you yourself were a part of was Gus's last salute. Could you share that one with the listeners?
Sure. Gus, as a matter of fact, I visited Gus's wife today at home. She had a cold, so I visited her. So it was we talked about his story.
Oh, wow.
She's now 93, I think, and I took care of Gus for a long time. Gus was a neat guy, and I could always tell Gus was coming because he had a limp from the shrapnel that he got at World War II, and he couldn't walk very well. But the story of Gus is that he was in World War II. He was marching into Germany as part of his platoon, and they all the guys in the platoon decided to rest for a little bit. It was toward the evening, and the shelling had died down a little bit. I think they just crossed into Germany, and the guys. And most of the guys in the platoon were smoking, so they formed a smoking circle, and Gus wasn't a smoker, so he was resting with another friend of his a little farther away, and all of a sudden they heard a scream of a shell coming in, and it went right into the group of smokers and killed them all immediately. And when the shell blew up, Gus took a lot of shrapnel in the legs. His legs were badly damaged from that, and his friend that also was with him, that was not a part of that smoking circle, was also badly injured. And they were all alone. There was no one else around them, so Gus had to spend the night, with his legs. As much as the bleeding he could stop, he stopped, and his friend was moaning in pain. And then when Gus evidently woke up in the morning, finally, his friend was not mourning anymore, and he was dead. The troops that were coming through found Gus and brought him back to the tent, the operating tent, and they decided to take his legs off. And he pleaded that they not take his legs off. And so they finally decided that there was a fellow in one of the army bases that knew a lot about fixing legs. So they patched him up as much as they could, sent him to England, and then ultimately to the United States, where he ended up with 17 operations. And Gus was a little bit of a drinker, evidently, and one night he tied one on, and the next morning he was looking for tomato juice in the wherever they get tomato juice in the hospital. And one of those cute nurses was there and helped him find tomato juice, and that was ultimately turned out to be his wife, Lucy, who I saw today. And so I took care of Gus for a long time, and when Gus developed Alzheimer's disease, he became bedbound, and he had to stay in bed. I visited him at home a number of times and got to know him, and Lucy told me his interesting story, because Gus would never brag about a story like that. And ultimately, when I was making rounds one morning, Gus was about 91, 92, and I knew he was slipping away. There's just too many things that had added up, and one of his wounds got infected again. And Lucy called me about 7 o'clock in the morning and said, I just want to let you know Gus just passed away. And I said, oh, it's too bad. You always feel bad when one of your friends. Gus was like every doctor has patients that they're special, and Gus was one of my special ones. You hate to make, you hate to say that, but that's true. Everyone has patients they love. And so Gus was one of the ones I loved, and I said I'd really miss him. And then I went down into the doctor's lounge a couple minutes later, and my partner was coming in from his car, and I said, oh, I just want to let you know Gus just passed away, and he turned white. And he sat down because he didn't know what to do. And I said, what's the matter, John? John Bourne's my partner, and he said, you'll never believe what happened. And I said, what? He said, well, I was driving in today. I would normally listen to the radio and to the news, because that's what I do every day. But this morning, I've never done this before, but I had this incredible urge to shut off the radio. So I shut off the radio, and I kept thinking about Gus and his life and what he meant to us, and the sacrifices that he made, and all the things that happened to him. And I said, Gus just died. And I said, what time did you shut off the radio? What time did you shut off the radio and began to think about this? And he said, it was 7 o'clock, which is almost exactly the same time that Lucy called me when she informed me that Gus had died. So John said, this is beyond coincidental. I think this was Gus's last salute to doctors that he had known and had taken care of him for 25 years. And I think that's true. I think Gus did give us a last salute. And it was pretty touching when John told me that story. And again, that could be a coincidence, but he and I both think there was something more than that when he had to shut off that radio and began thinking about Gus like that.
Yeah, that's definitely one heck of a coincidence if it was, and a beautiful story as well. So that said, death and the afterlife, what are your personal feelings on the afterlife? What do you think happens when we pass on?
I don't know if anyone knows for 100% certain, but I believe that we go somewhere. I believe in heaven. I believe that we are live in glory. I believe that we live with our Heavenly Father, and I've had some experiences personally that I didn't even put in the book about after the afterlife and people that have come back to participate in our lives at times.
And another section of the book is healing. And you had a great quote that was intangibles in medicine that help heal the human spirit. Could you talk a little bit about what that means?
Everyone, and I think when you look at the current literature in medicine and what people are talking about, there are some intangibles in medicine that help people get better quicker or help heal people. And those intangibles, I think, are optimism, a belief in a higher power, a belief in that you can be cured. And I think those things, and I've seen that myself, help people get better quicker. They recover sometimes in amazing ways. I think prayer is part of that, and I think there are some studies going on in medicine where people are prayed for in the intensive care unit, and other people aren't prayed for. The ones that they're prayed for seem to do better. So I think there's a lot of intangibles that are not pills or IVs or medications or procedures that make people and patients get better quicker, and people that don't believe, that don't have optimism, that aren't convinced that there's mind over matter, I don't think they do as well. And I think most oncologists and others that deal with patients that get very sick or have some serious illnesses will say the same thing.
And playing off that, how do you kind of see the medical world merging with the supernatural as far as you personally or other doctors? Do you think they'd be more open to not necessarily voodoo, but looking into spiritual healing, energy crystals, alternative medicine? Do you think that's something that could become more acceptable or tried by mainstream medicine?
I think maybe. What I see happening though is I see more religion in medicine than necessarily the spiritual kinds of things. I see doctors that are praying. I see doctors that pray with their patients sometimes, and talk a little bit more freely. Talk about God and religion as a means of helping people get through a difficult time and help people heal. So I see that being more prevalent, at least that's what I'm seeing, than some of the spiritual healings that you mentioned.
Right.
Although I think people are open to everything, and I think a lot of doctors these days are saying whatever works, let's go with it.
Right, yeah, and even if it's something that maybe like a crystal, which has no real power, even as you were saying, just kind of the hope it might bring, the positive optimism is what might actually lead to the healing.
It might. I think if people have hope in whatever, that they will do better than people that don't have hope. I think that's been shown in studies too.
Yeah, for sure. So before you had the incident with the lung scan, were you a believer in these types of events, supernatural occurrences?
I've got a reasonably strong faith, and I've always believed that there is something else out there. There is a God that intervenes in strange and wonderful ways, and so I've always believed that, and many of the doctors did too. but many of them didn't. And in the book, about half the doctors that had these experiences were, they weren't atheists, but they weren't strong believers. They didn't have a strong faith and didn't have an organized religion. And after these experiences, many of them were totally changed.
And it sounds like they might have. Have you found it hard to sort of have the world of science and medicine coexist with the world of faith and religion?
No, I don't think so at all. I think there's a place for science, there's a place for religion, and I think my book and books like mine will help people realize that those two can coexist very well together. I think that religion and faith make a difference, and that those provide the intangibles that we talked about earlier that may help people get through something and may help them heal in amazing ways.
Yeah. And then was there any backlash to the book coming out? Has anybody come out and said you're a quack? Or while asking other doctors, hey, have you ever had anything like this? Were you met with any staunch skeptics, debunker people who said, that's crazy, you're making it up? Was there any sort of negative experience with this?
I was shocked to find that there was none.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it. I was ready for all kinds of naysayers and people that would say, this is totally bunk, you are making this up to make money or whatever. And I've had none of that. Absolutely none. The doctors I talked to that are in the book, that have contributed stories to the book, have not either. In fact, the feedback that we are all getting is thank you for coming out with these stories. Thank you for bringing them out, because we have had experiences ourselves that now we feel more comfortable about talking about. And now I feel a little bit more comfortable about talking with my doctor about spiritual or religious things where I didn't before. So I was expecting all kinds of backlash and negative things, but I've had none, absolutely none.
Well, that is fantastic and good to hear. And I guess it plays into that so many people have had these types of experiences.
I think that's why. I think it gives people permission in reading a book like this and seeing that some credible people like these doctors have had experiences, that gives them permission to speak their own stories too.
And then do you think that doctors are maybe more likely to experience these types of things because they are dealing with people who are ill, people who are passing away soon or have just passed away, and just because they're dealing more with health and people maybe transitioning to the afterlife, does that increase their odds of experiencing these things?
I think so. I'm not sure. I can't tell you that for sure, but I think because doctors are dealing with life and death situations, they're dealing with people that they can literally help and save. I think they're a little more privileged to get some of these experiences than anyone else. Although I'm convinced that everyone has had experiences like these, and that if we just look back at the coincidences in our lives, we will realize that everyone has met someone on the elevator that helped them get a new job, or help them do some goal that they had set. I'm sure you have. I'm sure you've had experiences where there was a coincidence that you were just blown away by, that got you to do what you do, or moved you along, or someone in your family. Everyone, I think, has had these.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think you're right. I think maybe doctors are a little more privileged to have these because they deal with helping other people more so than others, perhaps. And
then finally, where can our listeners learn more about your book?
Physicians Untold Stories. It's available through Amazon. We have a website, physiciansuntoldstories.com. And if anyone has a story, I'd love to hear it. And we're working on a second book. I am working on a second book. And then we also are working on a television series. We have a production company in New York that's been out filming, and we're talking to different networks right now, and hopefully we'll have a television series based on the book by next year.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much for taking the time talking with us, sharing your story and your book with our listeners. And when the second book does come out, we'd love to have you back on to discuss it.
That's great, Tommy. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The Brothers Mysterium.
So that was Dr. Scott Kolbaba. Again, his book, Physicians' Untold Stories, available on Amazon as well as physiciansuntoldstories.com. Great book. Obviously, I would hope you're intrigued after our brief discussion. It's worth checking out for sure. And I want to thank him for taking the time. Great guest, very well-spoken, intelligent individual. Had a lot of fun speaking with him. And one thing that I thought was cool was his motives and reasons for writing the book are very in line even with this podcast, which is just kind of to document these events, number one. But number two is to sort of give people, hope, help, peace. One piece of feedback we get all the time is emails from people saying, I can't believe it. I thought I was the only one. I had this similar experience. I listened to your show, and now I'm more willing to tell my own story. So it's cool that he didn't just have an experience and say like, what the hell, I'll write a book. He actually had the intent of maybe this will help people. Maybe this will bring down some walls in the medical community, perhaps, to have doctors be a little more open. What are your takeaways from my chat with Scott?
There are times when I think one of the crucial questions that's asked of authors is, what made you write this book? And I just found it really enlightening that you realize that there are communities who don't get an opportunity to share their stories, to say, well, these doctors, many of them, the people that he talked to, had stories to tell. And even more amazing was, he said, as he retold the stories to some of his patients while he was working on the book, they had stories to tell of some of these types of experiences. So it's great that he's able to sort of open up this whole world that none of us were really aware of, that doctors have these types of stories. I thought that the story about the lung scan was really very moving, saying that it was again that sense of like being too smart sometimes. You say, well, we ran all those tests. It must have been this, it must have been that, that's been eliminated, I don't know. And then he just had this inspiration, which again could be something spiritual, or it could be his own experience, his own life experience, his own awareness, that when he stepped back from it, his mind sort of processed it in a clearer way, and he said, it's got to be something else. And he said, maybe it's his lungs. And then as it turned out, it was this pulmonary embolism. So I find that this whole community of doctors being able to share these stories and tell each other the stories, because sometimes the hardest thing in your life is to have an experience like this and not be able to tell the story.
Right.
Not share the story, not be able to open up and find out, am I crazy or is this something that's happening to other people?
And along those lines, as I said earlier, I had a hard time. I wanted to do this show like a year ago or more, and everybody I asked said, nah, nothing out of the ordinary. So that made me wonder, do they have stories? They just didn't want to share them on a podcast or tell me. He even said only within the last 5 years, really, has he started hearing doctors talk about it. And that also ties into only when he started asking them and saying, hey, do you have something? And kind of pushing it, did it come up? But as you mentioned, now he's finding patients have stories that they'll share. He did talk about even the religion and the prayer and how now doctors will pray for their clients. What do you call them?
Their patients.
Patients.
Yeah. Or with them. Yeah.
Or, even with them together, or at least have religious discussions with them, which is cool. Another great story was Gus's last salute, where I knew that Scott was an honest guy when he admitted that Gus was one of his favorite patients, and that doctors won't usually admit they have a favorite patient, much like a parent won't admit they have a favorite child, but he was open and honest. I won't ask you if you like me or Eric better, since he's not here, so don't worry. But and one of those things, again, where it's easy just to say, oh, it's a coincidence, but much like your story, where you had gotten in the car and suddenly get a phone call, oh, he passed away, and I was just with him a minute ago. He gets a phone call that, unfortunately, Gus has passed away, and just at that same moment, 7 a.m., same day, his partner's driving into work, listens to the radio every day, but on this day, he just turned it off, just sitting there with his thoughts, and his thoughts were about Gus and Gus's life. And he pulled up and just said, "Hey, man, I was thinking about Gus," only for Scott to tell him, well, Gus just passed away. So a lot of coincidences to have all those things happen at that exact moment. And another kind of cool and beautiful story, though, with a great title of Gus's Last Salute, as it was sort of Gus's way of saying farewell to the two doctors that had helped him so much and meant a lot to him in the later stages of his life.
Yes, yeah. And I think when doctors looking at the medical world versus the supernatural versus things like alternative medicine, there's probably professional conflicts there where they say, well, I really shouldn't be talking about that. I shouldn't be talking about alternative medicine, or I can't be thinking about medicine versus the supernatural. What if, if we just sit here and think about a miracle? But I think there's like a combining of those forces is maybe ultimately where we evolve into a better species at taking care of ourselves. Do you help heal the human spirit? Do you help somebody heal their mental crisis, and then that helps their physical situation? Do you get people through a point where, a lot of people have surgeries and have a very difficult recovery? Do they go into that with a sense of hope and healing? Are they prepared for the surgery in the right way? And are they guided afterwards through it so that you really do have a sense of desire to live, a will to live? I just heard a story the other day about somebody whose niece passed away, and the person who is a friend of mine was beginning to say, well, I wonder if she committed suicide. Did she just give up hope? That's a tragic circumstance when you think about it, when there's so much that we can do to help people. And maybe instead of just, again, prescribing more things, we have to be there and trying to work on this conflux of science and religion and helping them coexist to help people have hope to begin to continue. And again, just an interesting thing, the 4 parts in the book, the way he broke them up.
Right.
There's divine intervention, there's death in the afterlife, there's healing, and there's prayer. And prayer may not be rote prayers just repeated. It may be prayers in actual conversation. Just some beautiful points. I really think I'm moved to order his book and to read it and check out his website, because he sounds like an intriguing man.
Yeah, it was, as I said, great talking with him. And you just reminded me of 2 things that go, at least as he had said as well, kind of the intangibles of healing the spirit. And there's definitely cases where when somebody is more positive, they will do better, heal faster, they have hope for living. The 2 things I was thinking of is, one, the old saying that there's a lot of people that once they retire, they kind of just die because they love their work, all they do is work. Now they're sitting at home with no purpose and they give up. And another one was, I remember reading that a lot of people in concentration camps who either, if they knew that in a separate camp or the other side of the camp, their loved ones, their family was still alive, they would fight through. They had a purpose. As soon as they learned that they had died, the person would die. They would, and not just, they'd stop eating and sit in the corner, but they would die, a day later. And I think that ties into having a reason to live, having motivation, keeping it positive, because you have that hope. We'll live through this. We'll be reunited. So that was interesting. And I want to thank him for taking the risk, going public with the book, publishing it, because as we've said here, it's created a dialogue, a conversation for the medical community and everybody, just to talk about where the supernatural might meet the medical community. And just having an open mind. As he said, whatever works, works. You don't necessarily have to take a sound bath with gongs going off or sleep next to a power crystal or anything, but just keep an open mind. It never hurts.
One of the things that Dr. Scott talked about, especially with that in the story about the lung scan, which again, you wonder also how people process information and how they work, how do they get good at what they do. And it struck me that he kept the story of that person like top of mind. It wasn't like he was in such a mad rush through every day and so many patients. And I don't mean to be political here, knocking the healthcare system, but by keeping it top of mind and sort of letting it process and reflect on it, he then came to that conclusion, like maybe we're missing something. And when he heard that the patient was about to fly to Denver, he said, don't do that. Let's do this test first. And it turned out they discovered where this embolism was above his abdomen. So it's it's important for everybody in their life as you work through things and as you do your work or, do the things that you're good at and enjoy, that you allow them to process through your brain, because there's so much that we have in the way of accumulated information and experience that you get them to connect again in those ideas. And so I think it's just a really great story, and sharing the stories of other physicians is just a great lesson for everyone.
Yeah, and one thing I thought was cool was he said that about half of the doctors he talked to said that they were skeptics or atheists before they had their individual experiences, but afterwards that had changed, which I find very interesting. I love when people kind of flip over and experience changes them. They don't just brush it off. And I guess the takeaway from this is that religion and science, medicine and faith, they can coexist. They can work together to heal people and do amazing things. And maybe a proof of that is the fact that when I asked if there was any haters, any backlash, anybody calling him a quack, saying he should have his medical license revoked, he said he was shocked, but no, it's been the opposite. People have been very thankful, accepting of it. He said they're almost being hailed as like heroes just for being honest, which it kind of brings it all back to this very podcast and just having these discussions. It never hurts to ask questions, whether you believe in ghosts or not, or whatever it may be, whatever your religion is. It's good just to always be able to think about things, consider them, weigh the options. You don't have to decide this is true, this is false, this is real, this can't be happening. Just, as you said, take things in, consider them as you go about your day. So once again, we want to thank everybody who is part of the show, Jamie, Dina, and of course, Dr. Scott Kolbaba. One more time, if you want to order his book, Physicians Untold Stories, you can get it on Amazon or at physiciansuntoldsstories.com. And you can also reach out to him if you have any medical stories, if you are a doctor and perhaps want to be part of his next book. Or if you want to reach out to us and share your medical story, you can do so at thebrothersmysterium@gmail.com, facebook.com/thebrothersmysterium. You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at Mysterium Bros. And I would like to thank today's special guest co-host, Father Mysterium, for being a part of the show. Thank you for lending your insight and point of view to today's episode.
Thank you, Tom. Really a pleasure. Just to hear these people's stories and be able to talk about them and reflect on them is again, just an inspiration. And the kind of thing where you're just constantly keeping your mind open, listening to learn from other people. So great to be here.
It's our pleasure. One final time, if you want to pick up a copy of Physicians Untold Stories, you can do that at physiciansuntoldsstories.com or head on over to Amazon. Royalty-free music from this episode came from purpleplanet.com and bensound.com. I'd like to thank Honor Freiberg for portraying the voice of Dina's mother in that story. And as always, we want to thank The Never Grin. They are the band that performs our theme song that you're currently hearing. To pick up Mysterium apparel such as t-shirts, you can go to fightgiant.com. And, as you know, we love it when you rate and review us on whatever podcast provider you use, or give us a like on Facebook, facebook.com/thebrothersmysterium. You can also get in touch with us, send us a message through there, or on our other social media accounts at Mysterium Bros on both Twitter and Instagram. And if you have a story, medical or not, that you want to share, that you think would be great for our show, we'd love to hear it. You can email us at thebrothersmysterium@gmail.com. I'd like to thank Father Mysterium, who did a great job filling in as the co-host for this episode. Until next time, this has been the Brothers Mysterium Podcast.